The Senate chamber is thick with tension. The polished wood of the chamber's floor gleams under the harsh lights, the air crackling with the weight of a moment that feels like it could tip the balance of power. Senators are seated in their usual rows, eyes trained forward, a mix of weary concentration and quiet anticipation. The clock ticks on, but for those present, it feels like time itself has paused, holding its breath. At the front, on the floor beneath the towering flags, Kamala Harris stands like a figure carved from stone. Her posture is unyielding, calm, and deliberate. She listens as the senator from Kentucky, Rand Paul, launches into another one of his trademark diatribes, his voice rising with each word, all sharp edges and relentless conviction. His eyes lock onto her, trying to provoke, trying to break her composure. His words are pointed, dismissive, as if trying to erase the very legitimacy of her position. Madam Vice President, your legal arguments are a farce, nothing more than a political ploy, Rand Paul spits, his gaze seething with arrogance. You failed to grasp the reality of the law, of our Constitution. Your interpretation is an embarrassment. The room shifts uncomfortably, the weight of the attack hanging in the air. But Harris stands still, unmoving, her expression unreadable. There is no flinch, no flurry of defensiveness. She simply waits, her steady gaze never leaving Paul's face. And then, in an instant, it happens. With the precision of someone who knows exactly when to strike, she speaks, her voice steady, measured, the calm before the storm. Senator Paul, with all due respect, your interpretation of the Constitution is not only flawed, it's dangerously misinformed. The words land like a blow, silent but devastating. For a split second, the chamber goes still. Paul stares, his mouth open, his face contorting in disbelief. He's not ready for this, he never expected it. He stumbles for words, but none come. The Senate, watching in stunned silence, can feel the shift. The air, thick with tension just moments ago, suddenly crackles with something else, something electric. What had started as an attack, a moment of invincible arrogance, now seems like a desperate, crumbling attempt to hold ground. And Kamala Harris? She hasn't moved an inch. The Senate floor is no stranger to heated debates, but what transpired that day had the weight of something far greater than partisan politics. This was not just another political clash, it was a battle for the soul of American justice. For years, Rand Paul had built a reputation as the libertarian firebrand, a senator who prided himself on challenging the status quo. But his reputation had always come with a cost. Rand Paul had a history of dismissing the very legal principles that kept the country grounded. Time and time again, he'd found himself at odds with those who believed in the rule of law, the same law that had guided the American experiment from its inception. His approach was simple: undermine the legal experts, defy convention, and appeal to the masses with rhetoric laced with disdain for any form of intellectual humility. He made a career out of challenging judicial norms and legal precedents, branding himself as a champion of common sense, while subtly undermining the very foundations of American governance. It was his stance on constitutional interpretation that had led him to this moment. Rand Paul, with his usual bravado, had never been one to sit back and listen to the legal experts who spent their lives studying the Constitution. He had dismissed them as bureaucrats, elites, and so-called experts, instead championing his own interpretation, one that was flexible and, more often than not, self-serving. For him, it wasn't about upholding the law, it was about winning the debate. But Kamala Harris was no ordinary political adversary. As the first woman of color to hold the office of vice president, she understood the weight of every word she spoke. She had risen through the ranks not by bulldozing over people, but by listening, learning, and understanding the complex laws that govern the nation. Her legal background was impeccable, a career dedicated to ensuring that the voices of the voiceless were heard, and that the law served the people, not the powerful. This moment wasn't just personal, it was an ideological showdown. On one side, you had a man who had built his career by undermining legal expertise and challenging the principles of justice in favor of populist rhetoric. On the other side, you had a woman who had spent her life fighting for the very rule of law that Rand Paul so casually dismissed. It wasn't just about one debate, it was about the future of how America's legal system would be understood, interpreted, and applied. As Rand Paul continued his tirade, the stakes grew higher. His words weren't just words, they were attacks on the integrity of the very system that had allowed the country to thrive. Every legal precedent he scoffed at, every expert he belittled, was an affront to the American people who trusted that their leaders would uphold the law, not twist it to fit their own narratives. The room buzzed with unease. Senators exchanged nervous glances, some of them aware of the deep-rooted implications of this moment. This wasn't just about one senator's attack on another, it was about the direction the country was headed. Would America continue to respect its legal experts, its judicial system, and the values that had long sustained the nation, or would it fall victim to populist rhetoric and the dismissal of truth? Kamala Harris stood there, steady as ever. She knew what was at stake. This was a battle not just for her own reputation, but for the integrity of the Senate, for the very heart of democracy itself. She understood that the American people were watching. The stakes were nothing less than the trust the nation had in its system of justice. And then, as Rand Paul's words swelled to a fever pitch, a question hung in the air: would Kamala Harris rise to the occasion, or would the Senate allow this moment of arrogance to slip by, unchecked and unchallenged? But what happened next left everyone in the room speechless. Rand Paul wasn't just another senator. He was the embodiment of an ideology that had, over time, become more dangerous than ever, an ideology that preached the sanctity of the individual at the expense of the collective good, a doctrine that often put personal freedoms above the rule of law. For Paul, the Constitution wasn't a document to be respected or protected, but a tool to be bent, twisted, and used to support his own views, regardless of the precedents or the facts. He had grown up in the shadow of his father, Ron Paul, a staunch libertarian who had made a name for himself with the same fierce individualism that his son would later adopt. Raised in a world that revered anti-establishment rhetoric, Rand Paul learned early on to view authority with skepticism, especially when it came to the law. But his skepticism was more than just a healthy dose of distrust. For Paul, it was a call to arms, an ideological war against what he saw as an overreaching government, one that needed to be restrained at all costs. His early years as an eye surgeon could have made him a respected professional in a field grounded in facts, science, and evidence. Yet, even then, he often found himself at odds with the medical establishment, questioning the very science that had earned him his place in society. His public persona, one of stubborn contrarianism, began to take root as he pushed back against any authority that threatened his own views, even when that meant dismissing the established norms of the medical field. But it was in politics that Paul truly found his footing, first as a member of Congress and later as a senator. From the beginning, his brand of politics was one of relentless opposition. He thrived on the debate floor, challenging the very foundation of American democracy. He didn't just disagree with his opponents, he sought to dismantle their ideas, belittling experts and institutions in favor of his own, often misguided interpretations of the Constitution. He had a knack for turning a legislative debate into a personal attack, accusing those who disagreed with him of being elitists, insiders, or out of touch with the common American. In 2015, he rose to national prominence during his presidential campaign, positioning himself as the anti-establishment candidate, one who would restore freedom by dismantling what he called the deep state, the very same institutions that ensured the country remained a beacon of democracy and justice. His controversial stances on healthcare, foreign policy, and civil liberties were often steeped in rhetoric that ignored the complexity of the issues at hand. He rejected climate science, dismissed the expertise of doctors during the pandemic, and once even declared that the Civil Rights Act should have never been passed, arguing that businesses should have the freedom to discriminate. It wasn't just his stances that caused concern, it was his consistent refusal to engage with facts and data in a meaningful way. He rejected expert opinions on everything from public health to economics, preferring instead to create his own narrative, no matter how unsupported by reality. His arguments were always the same: experts were wrong, and only the people knew what was best. He was a champion for the outsider, the voice of the people, even as he pandered to the very elite he claimed to despise. But with every controversial move, every controversial statement, Rand Paul only seemed to grow more confident. His arrogance wasn't a shield to hide insecurity, it was his strength. It was the driving force behind his every action, his every word. He knew that his base, those who shared his anti-government, anti-establishment worldview, would follow him to the ends of the earth. And they did. With every bold stance, every challenge to the system, his political career grew. He saw himself as the only one brave enough to stand against the status quo, the only one willing to say what others were too afraid to speak. It was this arrogance, this belief that he had all the answers and that no one could possibly know more than he did, that had led him to this fateful moment. As he stood there, glaring at Kamala Harris, he wasn't just attacking her, he was attacking everything she represented, the very establishment, the legal system, the norms of democratic governance. He was convinced that, with his rhetorical skill and sharp tongue, he could tear her down just as he had done to so many others in the past. But what Rand Paul didn't realize was that he had met his match. In his mind, this was another opportunity to grandstand, to make a mockery of someone who didn't share his worldview. He saw Harris as just another political figure, someone he could easily dismiss with a few well-placed insults and a wave of his hand. But as he continued his attack, his confidence began to swell. The more he spoke, the more assured he became that he was in control, that he was winning this battle. His words were sharper now, laced with venom. He leaned in, throwing one final barb. You can call it a legal argument, but let's face it, you're just playing politics. You're a part of the system that's broken. A system that only serves itself. The room shifted again, the air thickening. Senators exchanged nervous glances, some shifting in their seats, unsure of how this was going to end. But Paul couldn't feel it, not yet. His confidence had him blind to the storm that was about to hit. As his words hung in the air, the tension was palpable. He was so sure of himself, so certain that his dismissive rhetoric would carry the day. Little did he know, the storm was coming, and it wasn't going to be one he could weather. Kamala Harris wasn't born into privilege. She didn't inherit power or fame, but rather, she carved her own path, a path that would lead her to the very heart of American politics. Her story was one of determination, resilience, and a commitment to justice that would become the bedrock of everything she stood for. Born in Oakland, California, to two immigrant parents, Kamala learned early on what it meant to be an outsider. Her mother, Shyamala, had come to the United States from India, while her father, Donald, hailed from Jamaica. Their union was one of love and activism, rooted in a shared desire for a better world, one where fairness and equality weren't just ideals, but realities. It was from them that Kamala inherited a deep sense of justice and an understanding of the sacrifices that come with fighting for what is right. Growing up in a time of civil unrest in the 1970s, Kamala was no stranger to adversity. Her childhood was shaped by the tumult of the civil rights movement, as well as by the feminist and anti-war movements that were sweeping through America. These movements taught her to question the status quo, to look beyond her immediate surroundings, and to see the world as a place in need of change. Kamala didn't just observe history, she became a part of it. Her parents instilled in her a sense of duty, to not only strive for success but to lift others up along the way. It was this ethos that propelled her forward, no matter the challenges. But her rise to prominence was anything but easy. Kamala faced the dual challenge of being both a woman and a woman of color in a world that often placed barriers in her path. In a profession dominated by men, particularly white men, she was constantly reminded that her presence was not always welcome. Yet, she never let these challenges define her. Instead, she used them as fuel. Every setback, every moment of doubt from others, only strengthened her resolve to prove that she was just as capable, just as worthy, and just as determined as anyone else. Her legal career began in the courtroom, where she worked tirelessly to defend the vulnerable. As a prosecutor, Kamala Harris made a name for herself as a fierce advocate for justice, tackling cases involving everything from gang violence to the abuse of women and children. She wasn't just fighting for convictions, she was fighting for the truth. She believed in the power of the law to serve people, not just punish them. She believed in fairness, equality, and that everyone, regardless of their background, should be treated with dignity under the law. Her time as San Francisco's district attorney helped shape the politician she would become. It was here that she made a name for herself by taking on difficult cases and refusing to back down in the face of political pressure. One of her most defining moments came when she was instrumental in changing how the justice system viewed nonviolent offenders. She pushed for policies that would offer rehabilitation over incarceration, demonstrating a forward-thinking approach to criminal justice reform that many had dismissed as too progressive. But Kamala saw the long-term benefits of rehabilitation. She knew that real change didn't come from simply punishing people, it came from lifting them up, offering second chances, and breaking the cycle of crime. Her rise continued as she moved into higher political office, first as California's Attorney General and later as the state's U.S. Senator. Each step was marked by her ability to connect with people, whether in her home state or across the nation. Kamala's reputation was built on her ability to navigate the intricacies of the law with a calm and measured approach, even in the face of the harshest criticism. She never lost her cool. Her voice, often a calm yet firm presence, was the steady anchor in the chaotic storms of politics. She understood that moments of high tension were when true leaders were tested, and her ability to maintain composure under pressure became one of her strongest traits. But it was her calm in the face of confrontation that set her apart. Where others saw conflict, Kamala saw an opportunity for resolution, for clarity. Her ability to listen, to remain patient, and to then speak with authority and conviction became her trademark. Whether on the Senate floor or in high-stakes negotiations, Kamala was never rattled. She had seen too much, endured too much, and fought too hard to be shaken by political gamesmanship. She knew the power of words, the weight they carried, and how to wield them effectively. Her experience wasn't just academic or professional, it was deeply personal. Kamala Harris's story wasn't just about overcoming obstacles, it was about building a legacy of service, of breaking down barriers for those who came after her. She had faced sexism, racism, and countless doubters along the way, but each experience had made her more determined to fight for those who couldn't fight for themselves. She had been that outsider once, unseen, underestimated, and she was committed to ensuring that no one else had to go through that same struggle. But the confrontation with Rand Paul wasn't just another day in politics for her. This was personal. This was about defending the principles she had spent a lifetime fighting for. It was about standing up to someone who had made a career out of tearing down those principles. Rand Paul's dismissive attitude toward legal expertise was the antithesis of everything Kamala had worked for. He didn't just challenge her, he challenged the very foundation of the justice system, the very system that had allowed her, as a woman of color, to rise to the highest offices in the land. In that moment, Kamala Harris wasn't just fighting for herself, she was fighting for every person who had ever been told they weren't enough, every person who had been silenced because of their identity. She knew this battle wasn't just about winning a debate, it was about defending the ideals that made America great, justice, equality, and the belief that no one, not even Rand Paul, was above the law. As she faced him, poised and calm, her years of experience and dedication to the law had prepared her for this moment. She wasn't just ready to engage in this debate, she was ready to win it. The room seemed to tighten around them, the air thickening with every passing moment. The Senate chamber, once a place of routine politicking, now felt like a battleground, charged with the electricity of impending conflict. Rand Paul's voice echoed through the chamber, rising in pitch as he leaned into his attack. He could feel the power of the moment, his words, sharp and cutting, were aimed at bringing Kamala Harris to her knees. "You talk about the Constitution," Paul sneered, his tone dripping with condescension. "But let's be honest, Madam Vice President, your understanding of it is dangerously simplistic. You wrap yourself in legal jargon as if that somehow makes you an authority. But we both know that the law isn't a shield for political games, it's a weapon for the truth." His words struck the air like a whip crack, the sharpness sending ripples through the room. But Kamala Harris didn't flinch. She stood there, poised and composed, her gaze unwavering. To the casual observer, it may have seemed like a simple exchange of words, but beneath the surface, the tension was palpable. Every senator, every aide in the room was waiting for something to shift, waiting for the moment when Harris would finally break her silence and deliver the counterattack. Rand Paul, sensing the control he had over the conversation, pressed on. The system you so proudly defend, the so-called justice system, is broken. It's corrupt. It's rigged by people like you who hide behind the law to push your own political agenda. You think the law protects everyone equally, but we both know the truth. It's used as a tool for power, for control. The words hung in the air, accusatory and sharp. The room was silent, every ear tuned in, watching intently. Paul's arrogance was on full display now. He wasn't just attacking her ideas, he was attacking her integrity, her very purpose as a public servant. His face was flushed with the thrill of his own rhetoric, convinced that this was his moment to land the knockout punch. He had underestimated her, just as he had underestimated every woman and every person of color who had ever been told they weren't capable of rising above the odds. But Harris didn't rise to the bait. She didn't let the insult land. Her calm, dignified composure stood in stark contrast to Paul's fervor. She wasn't moved by his accusations, his desperate need to provoke. She had faced far worse, had fought battles far more personal, and came out stronger every time. She knew how to wait, how to remain steady when the storm raged around her. And the storm was raging now. Her hands rested lightly on the podium, her fingers not clenching, not betraying even the slightest sign of tension. Her posture, perfect and unwavering, was a silent declaration, she was in control, and she wasn't going to be pushed into making a rash move. "Senator Paul," she said finally, her voice calm, measured, as if she had all the time in the world to respond. "You talk about the law as if it were a mere instrument to be manipulated to fit your ideals. But the law is not a weapon of convenience, Senator. It is a foundation. It is a living document, shaped by those who fought and died for justice, not for personal gain." Paul's eyes narrowed, his confidence never wavering, but it was clear, something had shifted. The room, which had been hanging on every word he said, now began to feel a shift in the air. They had been expecting the fiery back and forth to continue, to see Harris stumble, to see her back down under the weight of Paul's relentless attacks. But she hadn't flinched. She hadn't faltered. And that, in itself, was beginning to shake the very foundation of Paul's argument. The chamber was now fully aware of the power dynamic shifting. They could feel it, an invisible pressure building in the space between the two adversaries. Senators exchanged glances, some unsure whether to lean forward in anticipation, others instinctively straightening in their seats. The air seemed to pulse with tension, a beat, a pause, something was coming, and they knew it was going to be monumental. Rand Paul took a breath, perhaps sensing that he was losing the upper hand, but he pressed on, unwilling to show any sign of weakness. "Madam Vice President, the Constitution wasn't meant to be a blanket for the powerful to hide behind. It's meant to protect the people, ordinary Americans who struggle every day because of the very system you defend." His words, though sharp, no longer carried the weight they once did. They were becoming repetitive, hollow. His rhetoric was beginning to unravel, and the more he spoke, the more it became apparent that his attacks weren't landing where he intended. His arrogance had blinded him to the truth, he wasn't speaking to the American people anymore. He was speaking to his own echo chamber, and it was crumbling around him. The audience, those who had been waiting for Harris to respond, now held their breath. They knew what was coming. The silence stretched longer than it should have, and then, Kamala Harris spoke. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The force of her words, calm and assured, would be more than enough to cut through Paul's arrogance. And with that, the room knew, the balance had tipped. The moment was coming. Harris's quiet resolve had already begun to shift the debate, but the next move, that would change everything. The room was silent. The tension hung thick in the air, a suffocating weight that pressed down on everyone in the chamber. Rand Paul, having just finished his tirade, stood there, looking as if he had just delivered a fatal blow. His chest rose and fell with each breath, his face flushed with the heat of his own words. He had believed that he had the upper hand. He had believed that his sharp, dismissive attacks would break Kamala Harris, that she would crumble under the weight of his accusations. But instead, there she was. Kamala Harris, standing tall, poised, unshaken. Her eyes, steady and unblinking, met his. The crowd, sensing that something was about to happen, leaned forward. The silence stretched, and for a moment, the world seemed to pause, as if holding its breath. Kamala Harris took a deliberate step forward, the faint sound of her heels clicking against the floor cutting through the stillness. Her hands, which had remained calm on the podium, now rested lightly on the edges, her fingers steady, her body language exuding an air of quiet power. She opened her mouth, and the words she spoke carried the weight of everything that had come before them, the years of hard work, of dedication to the law, of fighting for justice when it would have been easier to give in. Senator Paul, she began, her voice calm but firm, you speak of the law as if it were a tool of convenience, as if it could be bent and shaped to fit whatever narrative you choose to tell. But what you fail to understand is that the law isn't just a collection of words on paper, it is a living document, shaped by the struggles of people who fought, bled, and died for the rights we enjoy today. The room held its breath. Rand Paul, who had expected to dominate, now stood with his mouth slightly ajar, his confident facade beginning to crack. He didn't know how to respond. His eyes flickered briefly, searching for an opening, but none came. Kamala Harris continued, her tone unwavering, her words cutting through the air like a scalpel. The Constitution, Senator, wasn't meant to be a weapon for the powerful. It wasn't designed to be twisted by those who seek to undermine its very purpose. It was written by men who understood that power must be held accountable, that justice must be blind, and that the rule of law must be absolute. And that is why we cannot allow personal politics to cloud our judgment when it comes to interpreting it. A wave of murmurs rippled through the room. Harris's words had landed. They weren't just a defense of the Constitution, they were a rebuke to Paul's entire approach to governance. She wasn't just standing up for herself, she was standing up for every person who had ever been dismissed by those in power, for every marginalized community that had been ignored by the system. Her message was clear, the law was bigger than any one person, bigger than any political agenda. She paused, letting her words sink in, and in that moment, Rand Paul's mask slipped. His face, once flush with triumph, had begun to pale. His jaw tightened, his fingers gripping the edge of the podium as if it could anchor him to the ground. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He was trapped in the silence, caught in the web of his own arrogance. The crowd shifted uneasily, sensing the shift in momentum. Senators exchanged glances, some leaning in closer, others shaking their heads in disbelief. They had watched countless debates, seen countless confrontations, but this? This was different. Kamala Harris wasn't just defending the law, she was owning the moment, commanding the chamber with the authority of someone who understood the power of words, the weight of truth. And then, just when it seemed like the room couldn't get any quieter, Harris dropped the bombshell that would leave the Senate, and the entire nation, in shock. Senator, you say the system is broken. But I'd argue that the system isn't broken, it's working exactly as it was intended to. The issue isn't the law. The issue is how some choose to interpret it, how some choose to bend it to fit their own agenda. There was a collective intake of breath. Rand Paul stood motionless, his expression one of utter disbelief. His confidence, which had been so unshakable just moments ago, was now crumbling in front of him. The crowd could feel the shift in the room, the subtle change in energy that signaled the end of Paul's assault and the beginning of Harris's reign in this debate. Harris's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. She had said enough. She was calm, composed, and in control. The audience, however, wasn't so quiet. The senators' eyes widened as the realization hit them. Kamala Harris hadn't just responded, she had dismantled Rand Paul's entire argument with the kind of quiet power that only comes from a deep understanding of the law, of justice, of what America truly stands for. And then, in a final, decisive moment, Harris leaned in slightly, her eyes never leaving Paul's. "You've underestimated me, Senator. And you've underestimated the law. But more importantly, you've underestimated the American people, who demand that we uphold the principles of justice, equality, and the rule of law. You can dismiss us all you want, but the truth remains, and it will always prevail." The silence in the room was deafening. No one moved. No one dared to speak. Even Rand Paul, caught off guard, was at a loss for words. The Senate, for the first time in this debate, seemed to collectively exhale as if the weight of the moment had finally settled in. Kamala Harris had won, not just the argument, but the room. Her words had struck at the very heart of the debate, cutting through Paul's arrogance and exposing the flaw in his entire narrative. She had shown the world that calm, dignity, and a deep understanding of the law could silence the loudest, most divisive voices. And as the chamber remained frozen in stunned silence, it was clear to everyone present, this was the turning point. Harris had not just defended herself. She had struck a blow for justice, for the Constitution, and for every person who had ever been dismissed by those in power. The moment had shifted. And there was no going back. What had happened in that chamber was more than just a moment of political theater, it was a seismic shift. The words Kamala Harris had delivered, so calm yet so powerful, had reverberated beyond the Senate floor, shattering Rand Paul's carefully constructed narrative and throwing the political world into disarray. In the hours that followed, the fallout from her mic drop moment would send shockwaves throughout the nation, and the world. Social media exploded in the aftermath of the debate. Within minutes, clips of Harris's masterful takedown of Rand Paul were circulating on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. The hashtag Kamala shuts down Paul began trending worldwide, with millions of tweets, shares, and posts flooding in. The footage of her calm, composed rebuttal was replayed over and over, the stark contrast between her dignified presence and Paul's flustered response becoming the defining moment of the day. It wasn't just a viral moment, it was an emblem of the power of reason over rhetoric, of composure over arrogance. Memes flooded the internet. Some were simple but powerful, images of Kamala Harris's poised, steady face with captions like, "When you own the debate without raising your voice." Others were more creative, juxtaposing Paul's frantic gestures with Harris's calm posture, accompanied by captions like, "The calm before the storm," or, "When the law speaks, even Rand Paul can't shout over it." On TikTok, videos with millions of views reenacted the moment with dramatic music, creating viral soundbites that had young people across the country quoting Harris's words. "The Constitution isn't a weapon for the powerful, Senator," was now a rallying cry for those who had been silenced for too long. The internet had a new political hero, and her name was Kamala Harris. Celebrities, political commentators, and pundits weighed in on the fallout. Hollywood stars like Reese Witherspoon, Mark Ruffalo, and Kerry Washington took to Twitter, posting their praise for Harris's performance. "Kamala Harris just showed the world what it means to stand up for the law and for justice," Witherspoon tweeted, followed by a flurry of supportive emojis. Mark Ruffalo, ever the activist, shared a clip of the exchange with the caption, "This is how we win, calm, clarity, and truth." But it wasn't just Hollywood that weighed in. Political commentators, long accustomed to the back-and-forth brawls that usually characterize debates in the Senate, were left speechless. MSNBC's Rachel Maddow, known for her sharp political analysis, took to her show that evening with a stunned expression. "What we witnessed today was nothing short of historic. Kamala Harris didn't just defend the law, she made a statement that will echo through the halls of power for years to come." Rand Paul may have been expecting a fight, but instead, he met a force that he couldn't overcome. Conservative pundits, on the other hand, scrambled to defend Paul. But even they couldn't help but acknowledge the gravity of Harris's performance. "Harris's response was devastating," said one right-wing commentator. "She didn't just shut him down, she exposed him. And she did it with such grace and authority, it's hard to argue with her logic. But it wasn't just the pundits and celebrities who reacted. Ordinary citizens took to social media, flooding the platforms with their own reactions. Tweets and posts from every corner of America, small towns, bustling cities, rural communities, poured in, all expressing the same sentiment, pride. People felt as though they had witnessed something bigger than politics that day. Kamala Harris's victory wasn't just about silencing Rand Paul, it was about defending the very principles that defined the American legal system. The law isn't a weapon for the powerful, one tweet read. It's a shield for the people. #Kamala shuts down Paul, another post said, Kamala showed us that power doesn't come from shouting the loudest, it comes from standing firm in the truth. The ripple effect of Harris's victory spread quickly across the political landscape. For Harris, the debate became more than just a win in the Senate, it became a moment that shifted public perception, not just of her, but of what she represented. The calm and calculated way she dismantled Rand Paul's arguments painted her as a leader capable of holding her ground against the loudest, most arrogant voices in politics. Where some saw a political fight, others saw a moral stand, a defense of the values America was built on, equality, justice, and the rule of law. As the hours passed, it became clear that Harris had emerged as a political force to be reckoned with. The ripple effect spread to the highest echelons of the Democratic Party, where many had already been eyeing Harris as a rising star. But now, the conversation wasn't just about her potential, it was about her power. The moment had cemented her as a leader capable of challenging the establishment, holding her own against even the most formidable opponents, and fighting for the people in a way that few others had done before. Even within the Senate, the mood had shifted. Those who had once underestimated Harris, who had perhaps seen her as a figurehead in the vice presidency, now saw her in an entirely new light. Senators from both sides of the aisle began to approach her with newfound respect, acknowledging the force she had just unleashed. Some even quietly admitted to their colleagues that they had never seen a performance like that in their careers. But for Rand Paul, the aftermath was a stark contrast. The barrage of criticism from across the political spectrum made it clear that he had lost more than just the debate, he had lost the narrative. The momentary advantage he had felt in the beginning, the confidence he had once exuded, had evaporated. His words, once seen as decisive, now felt hollow and disconnected. The aftermath was a reminder of how quickly political fortunes could change. And in the silence of his defeat, Paul found himself struggling to regain his footing. Kamala Harris's response had done more than win a debate, it had shattered a carefully constructed narrative of arrogance, of dismissal, of power at any cost. And in doing so, she had not only defended the law, she had reminded America of what it truly meant to stand for justice, dignity, and the truth. As the days passed, Harris's moment would be remembered as a turning point in American politics, a symbol of what could happen when the powerful were held accountable, when arrogance was met with dignity, and when truth ultimately triumphed over rhetoric. The political landscape had shifted. The public perception had been irrevocably altered. And for Kamala Harris, the fight had only just begun. The Senate chamber, now alive with whispers, was a far cry from the tense silence of the confrontation just moments before. But as Kamala Harris stood at the podium, her presence still commanding the room, it became clear that the true weight of the moment had only just begun to settle. What had unfolded wasn't just a political victory, it was a lesson. A lesson that transcended the walls of the Senate, a message that would echo far beyond the chambers of Washington. Kamala Harris looked around the room, her eyes sweeping across the faces of her colleagues, of the onlookers, and of those who had tuned in from around the world. The battle had been fierce, yes, but it was never about the fight itself. It was about something far greater, something that, even in the heat of this political contest, had never wavered, the truth. Senator Paul, she began, her voice calm and resolute, the strength of her words now a steady force in the room, we've had our differences, yes. And I've heard you claim that the system is broken, that the law is just a tool for the powerful. But I stand before you today, and I tell you this, the law isn't a tool to be wielded in the service of political agendas. It is the bedrock of our democracy. It is the compass that guides our nation through the storm of division, prejudice, and injustice. The truth, Harris continued, was not something that could be manipulated to serve one's personal interests. It was an unwavering constant, rooted in the ideals of fairness, equality, and justice that the Constitution had laid out. And in a moment like this, when the stakes were high, when the voices of power seemed to drown out those of reason, it was the law, guided by legal expertise, that held the nation together. Her words carried more weight than just legal jargon. They were a call to action, an affirmation of the importance of dignity in public service. She spoke not just to the senators in the room, but to every American who had watched this debate unfold. We must remember that justice is not a concept reserved for the elite or the powerful. It is for everyone. It is for those who have been marginalized, for those whose voices have been silenced, for those who continue to fight for their rights in a world that so often turns a blind eye. The room grew quiet as Harris paused, allowing the gravity of her words to sink in. She wasn't just defending the Constitution, she was defending every individual who had ever felt voiceless, every community that had been oppressed, every person who had ever been dismissed as too small to make a difference. Her message was simple but profound. The fight for justice was not just political, it was personal. It was about every citizen, every life, every family that depended on the integrity of the law to protect them. But it's not just the law that guides us, Harris continued, her tone unwavering. It's our commitment to the truth. To the ideals of dignity, humility, and service. These values are what drive us to serve, not for personal gain, but for the good of the people. For those who are looking to us not just for leadership, but for the example of what it means to stand for what is right, no matter the odds. As her words resonated, it was clear that this moment wasn't just a win for her, it was a victory for all those who had fought for justice and integrity before her. The lesson was clear: when we stand firm in the face of adversity, when we stand by the truth even when it's uncomfortable, we win. Not just for ourselves, but for the countless others whose voices would never be heard unless we used our own. Kamala's calm confidence had taken down the towering figure of Rand Paul, but it wasn't just about defeating an opponent. It was about showing the world that integrity, when it stands resolutely against arrogance, can bring about change. And in doing so, she had reframed the conversation. This wasn't just about political maneuvering, it was about restoring faith in the very system that had, for so long, been under attack. As I said before, Harris concluded, her voice rising ever so slightly, but still steady, the law is not a weapon for the powerful, it is a shield for the people. And it is through that shield that we protect what is good, what is right, and what is just. It is not about us, not about the politicians or the pundits. It is about every citizen who places their trust in us. We owe it to them to uphold these values. The room sat still, the words hanging in the air like a call to action, an invitation to rise above the noise and serve something greater than oneself. Harris's gaze never wavered as she looked out at her colleagues, knowing that this moment had not only solidified her place as a leader, it had redefined what leadership should be. The applause that followed was not just for the victory won on that day, but for the values she had stood up for, values that were now more important than ever. Kamala Harris had not just shut down Rand Paul, she had opened the door to a new vision of what American leadership could be, one rooted in truth, in humility, and in an unwavering commitment to justice for all. In the days, weeks, and months that followed, the story of her response would be told time and time again, not as a political strategy, but as a model for how to rise above the noise and lead with integrity. The moral was clear: when the world demands that we compromise, that we back down, that we follow the loudest voices in the room, there will always be those who choose to stand up and fight for what is right. No matter the odds. And in that moment, Kamala Harris had shown the world exactly what it meant to be a leader, not just in politics, but in life. It was a lesson for everyone who had ever been told they didn't matter, for every person who had ever been silenced: stand firm, hold the line, and the truth will always prevail. What we witnessed today was more than just a debate, it was a moment where justice triumphed over arrogance, where the rule of law was defended by someone who truly understands its power. Kamala Harris didn't just shut down Rand Paul with a legal argument, she reminded the world that the law is not just a tool for the powerful, but a shield for the people. Her response wasn't just a political victory, it was a testament to the strength of integrity, truth, and the unwavering commitment to justice. In that one moment, Kamala Harris proved that, no matter how loud the voices of division and arrogance may become, the truth will always find its way to the surface. This was a victory for everyone who believes in a system where fairness prevails, where dignity is the foundation of leadership, and where the law is used to protect, not to oppress. Harris's calm brilliance in the face of Rand Paul's aggression showed us the power of standing firm in the truth, no matter the odds. If you believe in justice, if you believe in the power of truth, and if you believe that leaders should stand up for what's right, then this is your moment. Join the fight for truth. Stand with those who champion justice. Share this video, subscribe to the channel, and be part of a movement that values integrity, fairness, and dignity in our leaders. Together, we can make sure that moments like these aren't just remembered, they can inspire change, spark a movement, and remind us all that when we fight for justice, we all win. Subscribe now, and be part of the movement for a better, more just tomorrow.